welcome to season 2 of the Mixtape with Scott. I'm the host, Scott Cunningham. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to one of my oldest friends in the profession, Melanie Guldi, an associate professor of economics at University of Central Florida. Melanie is graduated around the same time as me. I don't know if we came out at the exact same time. She may have been. I came out in 2007. I have a feeling we were on the market together, or maybe off by 1 year. We sort of worked in similar areas of health. It was like I was interested in sexual behavior. She was interested in fertility. And then sometimes it would be more similar than that, issues about contraception. She's been a steady, insightful, reliable, excellent empirical microeconomist from whom I've learned a whole lot. I've discussed even one of her papers in my book, Causal Inference to Mixtape. In this interview, we kind of cover a lot of ground. We talk about her life, just like all the other interviews. We talk about her life growing up, how she got into economics, and how she kind of migrated into the topics that she studies. But towards the end, we start talking about her own research into fertility, unwanted, unintended fertility, which as she started sharing with me the kinds of questions that she had to use to study that, I was stunned by what a complicated question it was. I don't know why I had always taken for granted what unintended births meant until listening to her talk about sorting through some of these questions. And I realized it was very complicated to figure out what exactly we meant and what we didn't mean. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do too. I want to, before I move into it, just kind of remind you the purpose of the mixtape. The purpose of the mixtape with Scott is to introduce you to people that I like and I'm interested in, learn their stories, because I'm of the firm opinion that we need in economics to hear the stories of other economists, to just try to make sense of the profession, try to make sense of our own part in it, and just to get to know each other a little better. So I hope that this interview is as interesting to you as it was to me. I highly encourage you to read some of Melanie's work after you listen to it. Thanks a lot. Well, it is really a pleasure to have one of my oldest friends in the profession, Melanie Guldi, here on the podcast. Melanie, thank you so much for giving me an hour of your time to be on the podcast.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
For the sake of the listener, could you tell us I said your name, but could you say your name, where what your job is and who your employer is?
Sure. My name is Melanie Guldi, and I'm at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. And my current position is Associate Professor of Economics.
Cool. All right. How long have we known each other?
I was thinking about this morning. We have known each other, I believe, since 2007.
Yep. That's what I think too. That's what I was thinking too.
We met at the Southerns in Charleston. So
yeah, that's right.
Check that.
That's right. I actually was going to reference it a little bit. Okay, cool. All right. So as an icebreaker, what's a vacation that you took as a kid, good or bad, that to this day you think about it every now and then? Doesn't have to be your favorite one, but it's one that you think about every now and then.
So we took a lot of family vacations to visit family that lives in New York or in Chicago. And I guess there's one experience on one of these trips that really stood with me, which was we went to a swimming hole in New York, and I was absolutely not going in this water because it was scary. And then I was forced to go in the water. And for whatever reason, I remember that really distinctly.
Yeah. Was it deep water or was it cold water?
I think it was cold and it was a little rocky to get into the shore. I was born and raised in Florida, and I was used to having flat, sandy beaches and warm Atlantic water. So
yeah. That's Yeah, it's funny how I grew up going to the beaches in Florida too, and like anytime you go to any other kind of beach, you can just tell all the subtle things that are really different. Just even with sand or the temperature and all this stuff, and it's a completely different experience. Um, and so you grew up. So you grew up in Orlando. Did you say you grew up in Orlando? Where'd you
No,
grow?
I grew up in a couple different areas of Florida. So I grew up on an island
Oh,
in northern Florida, north of Jacksonville, and for about half the time. And then I grew up closer to the Daytona Beach area,
mm.
and we also spent a couple years in Puerto Rico.
Oh, wow. What'd your parents do for a living?
Um, my dad was an air traffic controller until um, Reagan fired a bunch of air traffic
Yeah,
controllers.
that's what I thought you were going to say.
And then he was into more entrepreneurial type of jobs after that.
Yeah, that
And
must
ended
have been pretty devastating.
I was still pretty young at the time, so I think my parents insulated us somewhat.
Was that
Um,
pretty devastating for him though?
yeah, I think so. I mean, in some ways, like I think the classic kind of make lemonade out of lemons. And
Mhm.
I think he's very happy at this point that he was fired because it put him on a different trajectory that he ended up enjoying a lot more. So,
Mm. What
you
did
know,
he end up doing?
he got into real estate and then he got into mortgage lending.
Mm.
And then he ended up working in more commercial lending at a bank
Mm. Okay.
through about the Great Recession, which is, I guess, around the time he would have been retirement age. So,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
now he teaches people how to fly. He's a certified flight instructor. So,
Oh, wow. Wow.
yeah.
That's awesome. So what about your mom? What'd she do for a living?
She was a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you
So
close with, or, so do you have any siblings?
five,
Five siblings?
five. Hmm.
Are any of them multiples?
No.
No. Okay.
Mm-mm.
Just curious. All right. So if I could talk to your teachers in middle school, how would some of them have described you? Just like, random, like they're just observing you and they've watched you for a year and they're like talking to each other in the teacher's lounge and what would they say? Melanie Guldi's like this.
Uh, I'm not sure.
Not sure. You don't know what people's impressions
I
would be.
was I don't I was in a couple different middle schools and I don't I don't know. I just kind of was there.
Yeah.
And yeah.
You were kind of quiet.
Oh, super quiet.
Oh, okay.
No, I definitely was not allowed student at all,
Hmm.
ever, the whole time K through 12.
Okay. What was your friendship group like?
Small.
Yeah, you had some close friends though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
What
a
would you?
couple close friends that I'm still friends with today. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Okay. Well, what was your interests in high school?
I was busy all the time. I took a lot of classes. I worked about 20 hours a week and I was in clubs and I was in a couple sports.
What sports did you play?
I played like everything once. I went to a small high school, so you didn't actually have to have any talent to be on a team. So, I mean, like for example, I did swimming and I just swam whatever event they didn't have someone filling a lane. Like I had no talent whatsoever.
they're like, they're like, we have to forfeit if Melanie, if you don't show up right now
More or less,
and
we need this
swim.
many players on the field, and
That's great. Oh man. So did you like your high school? Did you like your high school experience?
um, yeah, I mean it was fine. I went to one place for ninth grade, and I went to a different place for 10 through 12.
Mm.
So
Was that starting over kind of hard?
I have a really weird hodgepodge of, having grown up in two locations, but even within the location, I was in two different kind of school systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back and forth between parochial school and public school. Uh,
Mm.
and so I don't know, for example, I went to public school in ninth grade and 8th grade, 7th grade, I was in one parochial school, which is a feeder to the high school that I ended up going to. So I knew a couple of people,
Mm.
but it was still a super small high school. So some of these people had been in school together since like pre-K.
Mm. Were your siblings some of your closest relationships, or were your friendships and some of your closest relationships?
Um, I I think maybe a little of both.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a sister a couple years younger than me, and she's probably the person I was closest with growing up.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of subjects did you sort of notice you both liked and or were good at?
My sister and I.
No, no, like classes.
Oh, that I liked in school.
Yeah, that you liked
Oh,
and or were good at.
so I think I liked math from the beginning because when I was in preschool and kindergarten age, we lived in Puerto Rico.
Mm,
So I learned all the early language, early literacy was all in Spanish.
mm-hmm.
So when we came back to the States for first grade, all the numbers looked the same, but all the letters sounded different. So I thought that was easier to think through math.
Oh, sure. Right.
I don't know though, naturally. I'm not sure I'm super talented at math,
Mm-hmm.
but I like it. I'm not
Yeah.
brilliant at it, but
Yeah. So then so when you were about to graduate high school, what kind of future did you sort of envision for yourself that you kind of aspirationally were hoping to have?
um I don't know. I think when I went to college, I wanted to be an engineer and I was thinking of working on solar cells. That was kind of my goal.
Mm,
Um, but when I went to some of the pre-engineering classes, I I didn't like the it's gonna sound funny, but I didn't like that it was so kind of cutthroat and male dominated. I
mm-hmm.
didn't like that kind of culture. So I
Engineering
switched.
was.
Yeah, yeah.
Which
Just
engineering were did you already declare a major, or were you already just thinking?
no, I went to University of Florida and at the time, and I think they still do this, they don't admit you by major, they just admit you and then you take the prerequisites to be admitted to the major.
Yeah, yeah.
So this would have been the maths and the sciences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
So you took so you were already taking some of the prereqs a little bit, and
yeah,
you got a
I didn't like I think it was chemistry, maybe.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's that was a deal breaker for me.
I feel like it just had very much the look to your left, look to your right. Those people won't be here at the end of the semester.
Oh yeah,
I don't like that kind of learning environment.
right, right. Because you're like he's looking at me, so I got to take him out. um, uh, so what? So then you were sort of like that was your freshman year. You were thinking you're not necessarily wanting to do the engineering. Did you have like a was there something else that happened that year that you sort of got curious about?
No, I mean, I that was my first semester, and so the classes I had intended to take in the second semester were no longer the classes I was going to take. So
Mm-hmm.
at the time, you basically had to walk around campus and find what classes were still open
Mm-hmm.
and get people to sign off on your classes.
Right,
And
right.
so the basic business courses had a lot of space. And so I ended up taking principles of macro.
Mm,
And then after taking that, it was super easy. So I decided that might be a good major to take.
yeah, yeah. You found that class to be pretty easy or pretty interesting.
I mean the professor that taught it is kind of a legend. He's retired now, but his name was Dave Denslow, Dr. Dave Denslow.
Mm,
And he talked super fast and he made it interesting.
mm. Made
And
them.
I had taken economics in high school and I thought it was enjoyable, the
Yeah.
topic in general. So I liked the macro class, so I just decided to do econ major.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it just was so. Would you have said that you loved economics after that first macro class, or what would you have said if not that?
I don't know if I loved it. I just thought it was easy, so I decided to take more classes.
Yeah.
I think I started to like it more as I got into the field classes.
Hmm.
Um, so I really liked macro, and I took a class in it was, I believe, called something like Latin American development, and I ended up writing my senior thesis on something related to commodity exports in Latin America.
Hmm.
Um, and so I really was interested in macro and trade and growth and all the things I don't do currently.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have some early publications that are kind of macro-y though. You've got these like exchange rate stuff.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting. My husband's also an economist. That's where I got drawn into those publications. But I've always liked macro. In fact, macro slash monetary.
Hmm.
So what ended up happening is before I went to Davis, I was working in a couple of different industries that were heavily linked with what went on with the US Federal Reserve decisions. So I worked in mortgages. And so every time the rates change, people, that business just goes bananas because people need to lock in whatever rate and want to buy houses or, have a harder time buying houses. It fluctuates a lot with what's going on with the Federal Reserve policy. And then after that, I worked at a securities firm, and it's the same thing. When the Fed meets, the markets can go crazy.
Hmm.
Uh, so it's like a really, frontline position to observe kind of the effects of the Federal Reserve. So when I was at Davis, I really I knew I wanted to do public economics, but my second field, I wanted it to be monetary economics. And
Hmm.
um, the grad advisor person was like, you need to probably do two micro courses. So I ended up taking IO instead,
Yeah.
which I loved IO as well. But that's kind of interesting. I have a field in public and I have a field in IO. And I guess you could say I write a few things that you could consider public, but I don't think I've written a single IO paper.
Yeah. Those are my two fields too. IO and public and
Yeah.
econometrics. And have never taken a health course and I only took one labor course.
I don't
But
think they even offered health at Davis when I was there. I think they might have started that after I had finished my coursework.
oh, okay. Okay. So you end up taking these field courses, but you're still kind of like really like in the macro.
Yeah, yeah. And so the couple of papers from quite a few years ago now on derivative market activity, some of those were the result of kind of my interest, my institutional knowledge.
Mm,
We use this daily price data from a handful of countries. And the former institution I was at, Mount Holyoke, we had a consortial arrangement with UMass Amherst, and I was able to access the data that we needed through that
mhm,
arrangement.
mhm.
And my husband didn't have access. So that was kind of like a big contribution. I could get access to the data, but also he'll probably be upset with me for saying this, but he tried to download this data into Excel and Excel choked on it. So um, we had to use some real data processing.
Yeah, like some real software.
So,
Uh,
which I have some more expertise in it than he did at the time.
right, right. So you end up going to Davis.
Mhm.
Was that so what year was that? That would have been like '01,
I did. I started in September '01.
September '01.
Yeah.
Um, I know that like when we go to graduate school, it's kind of like the invisible hand allocates us to whichever school that we end up going to. But was there a certain reason that you were attracted to Davis?
Um, yeah. So I had actually done a master's at Michigan State
Mm,
prior to, so right from graduating undergrad, I went to Michigan State. And to complete the master's there, I wrote a like an independent study kind of paper, and it was on welfare reform.
mm,
I had really wanted to look at some of the targeted policy, some of the targets of the policy were to reduce teen fertility.
mm,
And so I was, really interested in that topic. But by the time I got around to going back to grad school, I feel like Hillary Hoynes might have taken that space. I think she has a paper on that I might have come across.
mm,
And she was at Davis. And so when I got admitted there, it was pretty easy for me to know where to go.
mm. Wait, so was that your first exposure at Michigan State when you started to be like, I'm kind of interested in these large government programs and fertility
Well, I think my interest in micro probably started there.
at Michigan
I took
State?
I took a labor class, and I liked that a lot. I had my professor there was Jeff Biddle,
Mm,
and he does more micro and labor and a little bit of a history
yeah,
feel of his work. And I don't know, I thought he was insightful and interesting.
yeah.
So
And so you ended up writing, was he your like advisor, your thesis advisor?
I didn't write a thesis. I just wrote an independent study. I think at the time you had to have some kind of a test, kind of like a prelim, but for master students
Yeah.
is what they had. I don't know how they organized their program at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
So you had probably heard about Hillary Hoyne, and is that why you were like, she's at Davis, and you kind of were like thinking about people that were studying in this area that you had just done an independent study on?
um, I think I wanted to work in that area. Like I wanted to do something that related to sort of this like welfare reform, fertility, kind of just something related to fertility. I knew that going into grad school
Mm,
for the PhD when I started in '01. And I applied pretty broadly. And Davis was probably the best school I got into.
mm-hmm.
And I visited um, another school I was thinking of going to, and it was more macro. And I think they had really good macro, but they didn't have other fields that were really good.
Yeah.
And I also called and talked to a couple of the people at Davis, one of them being Hillary Hoynes. And um, she said something that kind of stuck with me. And you should go to the best school that you got into because it'll give you more doors that will open later.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, sad but true. I think that, um, I don't know, sad but true. But I think there's some truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it means that you can't do really awesome things without going to like, but
Top 10 school or whatever. Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, like, there's what's there are people that have gone to programs you probably never heard of that now everyone knows who they are.
Right.
So I mean, I think there's always a path. If it's not just your school that matters.
Yeah. Sure.
And I would say, like, the top ranked students at Davis are probably better than, I don't want to pick on other schools, but
Right.
there's overlap
Yeah.
with other
Sure.
programs. Like it's not a, it's not a it's not a straight up and down line
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah. But your
quality.
cohort at Davis is really good. Jason
Yeah, and
Lindo, Alan Barreca, you, Matt Pearson. I'm trying to think of
Jason
some more people.
Lindo.
Did I say Lindo?
I said Lindo
Yeah,
too.
Jason
I mean, he's in
Lindo.
that.
Um, there was a bunch.
Yeah, Nick Sanders.
Nick Sanders. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's I
So
always
they're
really.
they're all like in the class after me. I'm not sure I would have gotten in their class, but
Well, Matt Pearson told me you guys had this really good public labor combo that really
Mhm.
you learned a lot from. What was that class?
So the Davis is on the quarter system, and uh, at when I started, I think they just had not just, but they had public, which was taught by um, Marianne Page, who's amazing,
Mm,
Hillary Hoynes, and I think Doug Miller might have been the third one in
hmm
there. I can't remember. Um, but then what what I realized is they were all very good at teaching in a way that was really an applied micro type of way of teaching public.
Yeah.
And so even though the focus of the material that we covered was more on the public economics questions,
hmm
the type of analysis was this kind of causal inference type of analysis
hmm
that was applicable in a lot of different areas,
mm
namely some of the stuff I do now, which is maybe more in the area of labor, maybe the area of health economics.
Did it feel different coming from that macro and coming from Michigan State? Did you feel like because you were probably working with data, but like did you get a sense that there was something unusual or different about the way that they this applied micro approach?
So I should say, I mean, and this is maybe giving away my age a bit, but when I was at Michigan State, um, the macro classes, we when we computed like impulse response functions, we inverted matrices by hand.
Mm,
Weren't really using computerized anything.
mm,
Um, Maybe once in Gauss or something, we might have done something, but it
right.
was mainly very analog type of macro.
Yeah.
We had it was like this rational expectations type of time period where that was kind of really big. Um,
hmm
so then by the time I went to Davis, the macro was more real business cycle macro.
mm,
It seemed like a completely different topic. Uh,
mm.
so I don't know. It was just different.
Did you
And
like it? Did you like that material?
I mean, I like macro. I think I was more, I think I figured out at the tail end of my time at Michigan State with doing my independent study that what I really was interested in was fertility issues.
Mm,
And although I am like happy to do research in all these other areas,
hmm
and I was interested in monetary and I was interested in this. And I actually, when I was working at the securities firm, one of the things I did was I followed corporate bonds. And one of the bonds I was assigned was in the telecom industry. And
Yeah.
they were doing all these auctions for telecom licenses.
Yeah.
And this was a big area of IO. And I mean, I wrote like my class paper on that
hmm
for IO in grad school. And I could have easily gone into IO because I found those topics really interesting as well.
Yeah.
Um, and what ended up happening, and like maybe why ultimately I landed on studying fertility versus one of these other things, is that I realized with IO that I probably wasn't going to be too interested in theory for theory's sake alone.
Mm,
Um, and so I wanted to work with data, but to have interesting data with IO, you almost have to have some insider connection with a company or with, it's harder to get a hold of the data.
yeah.
And with public, but you would work with publicly available data.
Right.
Um, so it was more of a level playing field,
Yeah.
but
But
I
wait, so how
pursued
did you
that.
get so why fertility? Because you've
Oh,
stuck with that your whole career. What was that seems
yeah. So
random?
it's a little bit related to my childhood. So I mentioned like I grew up on an island, and
Mm,
it was a not a big island. We didn't have a high population. And at the time I lived there, there was one elementary school, one middle school, one junior high and one high school. Everybody who went to public school on the island all went to the same school.
Mm-hmm.
And it was K through third, fourth, fifth, and sixth was the middle school. And then seventh, eighth, and ninth was the junior high. And then high school was 10, 11, 12.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember being in, I want to say it was in fifth grade. And I noticed there were girls in my school that were pregnant.
Mm.
And I was wondering why.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just sat with me for a long time, trying to understand why. And then later on, when I was in eighth grade, my parents are still married, right? It's the same relationship, but there were three of us born in the 70s. And then there was a big break, and then my mom had three more children.
Mm.
My parents had three more children. And that was also kind of related. Why would you choose to have this many additional children? And so it kind of it fed into my interest for fertility broadly defined, sort of determinants of fertility. Why do people have babies when they have babies? Why do they not have them when they don't have,
Right.
And so I think it certainly the sixth grade experience, it was the sixth grade girls that were pregnant. Kind of looking back, I'm sure that had a lot to do with a lot more than just waking up as a sixth grader and deciding to be pregnant.
Right.
So it doesn't really fit entirely with a, deterministic model of fertility.
Right.
So I think in retrospect, there was a lot more to unpack.
Yeah.
But that's probably where a lot of it started.
Yeah. And it's like you're already an economist, so you're starting to think about policy. As opposed to like if you had been majoring in psychology, you might have been interested in fertility and just kind of focused on, well, I don't know exactly how they study fertility, but they may not be thinking about, aid for dependent children and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's true. When I was trying to figure out what to do for graduate school, when I ended up at Davis, I had this, I don't know, period of time where I was trying on different hats. I almost went to sociology. I think
Oh,
that would have been a fine match. Like I read Emil Durkheim and I never took a sociology class as an undergrad, but I kind of got into thinking about what is sociology. When I was an undergrad, I took I took a couple anthropology courses. I was almost an anthropology major.
mm-hmm.
Um, I like that topic as well. So I think it could have gone a lot of different ways.
Yeah. So is it a good fit? Is econ
I
a
think
good
it, I
fit?
mean, I think being a academic economist is a good fit for the moment. I I feel so so why do I say that? In my positions I had between grad school and then Davis grad school, um, I I usually advanced pretty quickly at the companies. I was promoted pretty quickly. I made decent money. And when I left the securities firm, I was kind of on this, should I become a chartered financial analyst or should I go to grad school? That was my choice
Yeah.
set. And I mean, I think ultimately I decided to go to grad school because I felt the career paths, I just kept getting bored. I felt limited in what I could think about in a way. As you know, financially unstable as it was to go to grad school, it seemed like long term it would be a better fit for me. Because as you can see, my research is not only fertility, it's a heavy theme, but I've been able to branch out and look at health related topics. I've delved into things that are more historical in nature as it relates to fertility. Um, I have papers that look at obesity and the air ambulance market. And, it's just things that are completely not fertility at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think if I had been in a position where I'd been in a job that kind of pigeonholed me into one area, I don't think I would be as happy as I am being able to have that flexibility to kind of take on a lot of different questions.
Yeah. Are there things you don't like about being an academic economist?
Um, I mean, I don't I don't know that there's anything that I really don't like. I don't tend to focus on the negative
Mm,
usually. Um, I mean, I think there's individual people or individual instances that haven't always been so nice,
mm-hmm.
but I just choose not to dwell on those.
Mm-hmm.
I think I get that from my parents, maybe more so from my dad. You can't dwell on all the negative things. Why didn't, I get into that conference? Why didn't, I get into this? Why does this person get this and I don't get, it's just like what do they call that? The envy is the thief of joy. Um,
Right.
and so I don't, I don't know. Like, I know I'm not the most brilliant person on the planet, and I'm not trying to be. I'm just trying to ask some interesting questions, do some research, and enjoy life.
Yeah. 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 The I used to call it Vita envy. I would and I would just literally it felt so masochistic. I would just go on the internet and look at probably, I would also look at your Vita, I would look at other people's Vitas, and I would just be like, I suck so bad. I'm the worst person. It's these stories you just tell yourself, I mean, they're not helpful stories to tell yourself that your value is rooted in any of your accomplishments anyway, but they can be so brutal, when you're in, tenure track can be pretty bad time,
Yeah, yeah.
in general.
And it's so idiosyncratic, um, what happens.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, I mean, I've seen so much more of how decisions are made, um, you know, hiring decisions or, journal decisions. You know, just, I don't know, I recently reviewed a paper and the other reviewer on the paper and I just thought the paper was great. And then at the end, it wasn't accepted at the
Mm,
journal, even though it had two very positive reviews. And it was because it wasn't general interest enough. And
no.
I was just like, well, if that's the case, why did you send it to reviewer? It
Yeah,
just
right.
doesn't square with me. Like, why do you waste people's time?
Right. Right.
That's the decision you're going to make at the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's,
I don't know if outside of econ people really can completely appreciate what you're talking about right now. How
yeah, that's
the
probably true.
these close calls. I mean, there's an equivalent of it in, in equilibrium. Every field has this exact same thing. It might be more aggregate number of events or, like some other thing, but in our field, it's like these singular, we have such low output, these singular and such hierarchical journal structures that have really big, sometimes, like quantifiable benefits and sometimes very difficult to quantify benefits, but they're very salient. These close calls can really hurt. If you let them, they can hurt.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but then that's where, I guess I landed on, I've been super lucky at a lot of turns.
Mm-hmm.
Just I almost didn't go to Davis. I almost went somewhere else because they offered me a lot more money.
Mm,
And that would have been a short-term decision versus a long-term decision.
yeah.
And I ended up going somewhere that had a lot more risk, but um, I was okay with, I don't know. I just felt like I was going to give it a shot and I was going to put my all into that. And then if
Yeah.
it worked out, it worked out. And if it didn't work out, it didn't work out. But I
Right.
was still lucky that they even admitted me in the first place.
Mm, yeah.
Um, they could have just said, I don't think she's good enough for this program.
Yeah. Right.
Um, and I think that's true with any of these. Um, you submit a paper and then, you hope it's going to get published somewhere eventually. And sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not.
Yeah.
I've had stuff waiting on decision for more than a year for first decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
That
I
was
was
it.
experiencing that as an assistant,
Yeah.
I don't even know if I would have a job right now, not
Uh,
in academia. I mean, I feel like I would have a job somewhere because I'm qualified to do lots of different things,
right.
but
Right.
could have easily not ended up getting tenure.
Yeah.
I'm lucky to be at Mount Holyoke when I had my kids because they were um, very kind to me with regard to parental leave.
Mm,
And um, I really thought it wasn't going to work out for a
yeah.
while. And then I had some senior colleagues that kind of forged a path for it to work out.
Mm,
Um, and so I don't know. I don't think I would have the academic track record I have if I hadn't had these little lucky events happen.
yeah.
And I just was fortunate that, people with tenure kind of put their foot down
Yeah.
and made sure I had some kind of protection.
Yeah. I've heard that called, there's mentors and there's sponsors, and
Yeah,
you need
both.
both. And probably at the margin, we need, to reallocate towards more sponsors,
Yeah.
because sponsors kind of put their, neck on the line. They incur real costs. Mentors, it doesn't like cost you. It costs you opportunity, cost of time to
Mm-hmm.
mentor, but to sponsor is to use scarce relationships and
Mm-hmm.
bet on people and all this kind of,
At
awkward.
personal
It's
risk.
all like behind the scenes, kind of like advocating,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even awkward conversations,
Yeah, and sometimes like personal risk. Like,
personal risk. Yeah.
they have some skin in the game they could lose.
I was at my third year review at Baylor, and I had that research agenda on sex work, and it was not panning out.
Mm-hmm.
And any department would have let me go, to be honest. And you would think definitely a religious school like Baylor would. And I remember this gentleman, Joe McKinney. He stood up, and in the middle of a very uncomfortable conversation between various people in the department about me staying. And he just stood up. He was just this gentleman, very older. I'm sure the sex work research did not feel like real economics and/or made him feel very comfortable. And he just said, we let Scott be here this long. I don't see the risk in letting him stay a little longer. And, he had the respect of the whole department. And I just remember thinking, uh, that was fortuitous.
Mm-hmm.
That could have he could have been sick today,
Yeah.
and not been there, like, or just not been there. There's so many ways that you provide public goods to the department that are not necessarily like service oriented always. They're just like being part of the community, and then that has real payoffs. Not just for you they're all external. I mean, a lot of them are external payoffs because they're for your junior colleagues and stuff. um you one time said this comment. We've talked about this recently. You were talking about an experience with a paper, and you said that you didn't mind like getting criticized. You just really wanted everybody to keep both hands above the table.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, like there's this subreddit on Reddit called Explain to Me Like I'm Five, where you can like
Oh,
ask, like explain to me like I'm five. So what does that mean? And I was wondering if as you answer this question, you could keep this in mind. What would it look like to have one of the hands under the table or have a fake arm and it looks like both hands are above the table, but really only one is. What is it? What did you mean by that phrase?
so when I think of hands above the table research, I just mean that when you read a paper, that the people writing the paper are very transparent with what's being done in the paper. Now, I say that with the lens of an applied microeconomist, where usually you're working with a lot of data,
Mm-hmm.
and you can do something called p hacking, which is just running every type of analysis under the sun till you get the results that you're looking for,
Right.
and then only showing those. Um, I've seen it in papers where in one regression they use this sample, and then on the next page in a different regression they're using a different sample, and then the next regression it's a different sample,
Right.
and not explaining why there's different samples. Sometimes there's a reason why, right?
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
then if you're kind of not writing about that in the paper and it's just buried in the number of observations without any explanation,
Yeah.
that looks a little suspect.
Right. 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 Yeah. So, your dissertation, you
Mm-hmm.
you you end up writing on a topic that I think has been getting a lot of renewed interest after Roe v. Wade, and it was abortion policy and contraception. Was your job market paper the one that goes into demography?
Yeah.
Okay, so could you tell? So I'm just kind of curious um, about the process of searching in graduate school and kind of like landing on that project and what that project was about.
So to circle back to one of the areas I was interested in before going to Davis was this welfare reform and thinking about teenage fertility. That was one of the big policy targets of welfare reform, was to reduce this unmarried fertility, particularly teen fertility. And by the time I got around to the point where I'd be writing my dissertation, a lot had been written already in that area. And so I was, reading more widely to try to identify something that would be a policy that would affect fertility.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe I read Golden and Katz's uh, pill paper.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I just thought more could be done to look at the fertility of young women and
Mm-hmm.
changing, contraception access. That was like a big part of their paper.
Mm-hmm.
They have part of their paper looks at abortion, but
Mm-hmm.
the fertility wasn't the focus of that paper. It was
Mm-hmm.
kind of not really, directly a big part of the paper.
Yeah.
In fact, it's been a really long time since I read
Wasn't
it.
it like
I
labor
don't
force
think they
participation rates or marriage rates
so
or something?
they were more interested in what happened to the education of women,
Education.
and as it relates to the pill, and then what happened to occupational choices of
Mm-hmm.
women, which is um, ultimately, I think, why people are interested in what has happened to fertility.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a labor economist, you're interested, if all these people are making different fertility choices,
Mm-hmm.
how does that feed into their choice of education, which is linked to their choice of occupation, which is also tightly wound up in their choice of marriage, and
Yeah.
all of that kind of feeds together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think their paper did, a spectacular first pass at looking at education and occupation, and no one had done this for the pill before them. And so,
And they had that little natural experiment part.
yeah, yeah. And so I think so. Martha Bailey and I probably had a similar idea to begin with, to look at the fertility side of things in more
Mm-hmm.
detail. And we had each independently went out and collected a wider set of laws that related to the legal access. And I think she was much more focused on contraception. I was focused on contraception, but also, as I was reading through a lot of these statutes and legal papers, some of the laws that regulated contraception also extended access to abortion once it was legal. And sometimes states had laws that restricted contraception but made abortion legal, and sometimes it was vice versa.
Mm.
And so that's what I landed on, was kind of trying to understand um, how these things mattered for
Yeah.
fertility of young women.
You and Martha are friends, so this is something that probably isn't wouldn't I hope it's okay to ask this, but like I think like a lot of people in economics get this anxiety. I don't know. You're so even keeled, that you're probably gonna tell me you never felt it, but like I have had it several times where I feel like I'm in what I would call a race with someone where they
Mm-hmm.
have a similar paper. And I was wondering, when you and Martha, since y'all both kind of go out on the market together with a similar paper, what did that feel like?
So just to be clear, I think Martha was a year or two ahead of me on the idea. I just wasn't aware of her idea when I started mine.
Mm-hmm.
And she was on the market. I want to say it was the year before I was on the market, and her paper was already, polished. And so for me, it was kind of like, what is it like with Stackelberg? You have like the first mover and the second mover.
Right,
I
right.
was the second mover in that situation.
Yeah,
So I mean, for me, it was more, I knew she already had her paper. Her paper was already out there. So it wasn't trying to compete, it was trying to differentiate.
yeah, right, right.
And so, um, you know, I, that's all there was with that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and
Yeah,
she,
that's one of these things, though. I don't think people outside of being PhD economists, like, or maybe it's in other fields, but like people, I don't. I bet, like, as an undergraduate, that you can't even like have like a framework for what it feels like to have this project, and then the quote novelty of it goes away. But for me, like, it can be really devastating.
so I think there's two ways to look at it. One is, you can feel, I don't know, a little bit deflated that somebody else has this idea.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, because I have tons of ideas. I just don't have, as you can probably imagine, because you have a lot of ideas as well. There's no way you can pursue every single idea you have.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you're working on something and you bookshelf something and you think you'll come back to it.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's not what happened with Martha and I. But when I saw her paper get into QJE, not that I would have gotten what I had into QJE, but I thought like, wow, my idea, like along those lines, like it wasn't a stupid idea.
Right.
Was
Right.
thinking in the right direction,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want to pretend like I could. I'm not trying to equate myself with Martha. I think she has like she's a different level.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, like it's happened, where I have these ideas and I think, okay, I'll work on that next year. And then
Right.
I'll go to a conference and, I'll see someone doing a spectacular job and I'll say, okay, well, I guess I won't be doing that idea
Right.
anymore. So, and
I don't
I've
think
done
you.
that a couple of times, like where, I've had stuff even semi well developed and just seen people that have kind of taken it a little bit further and done
Yeah.
a little bit better job. And I just, I think I'm more inclined for a lot of things not to compete.
Yeah.
Or, and this has happened in some other work, where I might have been more on the first mover team and
Mm.
just been open with other people, like, maybe you can differentiate from us and
Right.
we both win. We
Right.
think it's an
Right.
important topic. Let's both work on this.
Right.
We have.
That is so what I associate with your personality though. You're like you're cool, you're even, you're steady, you're like a glass half full person. Even the things that my first memory of you at a conference was you like organizing these dinners. I think I've always told you that. I always saw you as like a person that just brings people together, is always just like, as opposed to cliquish and try to put people down.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that you say that, because that just seems so consistent with what I think of as your personality, is just like uh you're just you almost I've seen you be happy for other people more than anything. And uh your self-esteem isn't so wrapped up in in like the Vita. I went for a long time. My self-esteem was wrapped up in my Vita, and then I had personal tragedies, and I was like, well, that was the dumbest thing ever. That's completely not remotely powerful for difficulties in life. It's, that was a bunch of wasted time to make my self-esteem based on it. Or because there's just nothing about that stuff that can help you when times get hard.
I have to say, like, I think if you had known me before Davis, like a few years before that, I was kind of a different person, but I went through some stuff in
mm,
my late 20s. And I just feel like there's the person before and the person after. And
mm,
I think it I think it really grounded me um in a way that I don't like. I care about publishing my work.
totally.
I think it's important, but it is not the only thing. And it's certainly not the most important thing for me in my life.
Right.
Um,
And
and
things can change too.
yeah,
When you're tenure track, you can sort of afford to be like reallocate a little bit and be like, because I want to live in this town, I going to make it a little more important. And at the margin, sorry I interrupted you.
no, I was just gonna say, I think you, I went into grad school having had basically two careers in two different areas. They were
Mm-hmm.
both kind of in the financial industry, but they were completely different. And I just had this feeling like I had a realization working that I had a lot of skills. I could probably get a job making enough money to feed, clothe, and house myself.
Right.
And once you do that, it's all bonus.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I think like just having that mindset, you know, I I tell this to people, like you go to a party and I've been to places where people are wearing like $5,000 sweaters and just
Mm-hmm.
like the money is just oozing off of them.
Right.
But like, does it matter if your sweater is $5,000 or you got it at a thrift store? I mean, you're the same person.
Yeah.
It's just extra,
Right.
right? What are you getting from that extra money that you've spent on clothing?
Mm.
Um, so I think I went in with that mindset to grad
Yeah.
school.
Mm-hmm.
And I figured if it didn't work out, that's okay. I could just go get a job doing something else. Like I
Right.
really, and I still feel that today. Like if it doesn't work out, I have tenure at my institution, but hey, if it doesn't work out, I can always go sell umbrellas on the beach or,
Yeah.
like I have
Right.
my backup plan of
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just always feel like this is what I'm doing right now. And I
Mm.
mean, I hope it's going to continue to work out, but you never know what's around the corner. Stuff could happen.
Yeah. It's so psychologically healthy the way you talk. I've been in like, 15 years of therapy. So like you talk, you talk the way that I aspire to feel. So it's
I think, I think it's one of these like, genetic lottery. I feel like my parents are both extraordinarily positive people.
mm,
I never saw my parents, depressed, or I
mm-hmm,
never saw them give up on anything. They always had resiliency and optimism,
mm-hmm,
and they had good times, they had bad times, they had ups, they had downs, they had good things happens, bad. I mean, they just kind of went through a lot of different stuff.
yeah,
But I don't know, they just kind of bounced every time. So I think, why could they bounce every time? I think it's their mindset
yeah,
was just in a place where they were able to refocus on the next thing, or the positive, or
mm-hmm,
you know
yeah. Well, last question, I have this feeling you're much better than most of us at living in the present and not living in the future and living in the past. So I guess I was going to say, what these days do you look forward to the most? And you're that you like, wake up and you're really you like the most right now.
Well, that's a hard question. I don't know. I wake up and I just kind of live moment to moment. I mean, I honestly, I think my family and my husband and my kids are my number one.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Anything else could go away. But if
Mm-hmm.
I lost my family, I think that would feel like the world had fallen out from beneath me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's what I think is my number one.
Yeah. Well, so transitioning a little bit, I read this paper recently by Melissa Kearney and Phil Levine about these shifts in fertility since the Great Recession, and I noticed that you have a new paper about that with Lucy Schmidt and Casey Buckle about big trends in fertility. I was wondering if you could just tell, for the sake of the reader, for the sake of the listener, just kind of like what's going on in that study with Casey and Lucy.
So I think that there's been a big decline in U.S. fertility since the early 90s. Isn't a huge new piece of information, but I think researchers have been trying to unpackage that for a while. Melissa and Phil, in particular, have been very active in this area, and some of my own work has looked at this in general. As far as the new paper with Casey Buckles and Lucy Schmidt, we we focused more so on the last, say, about 20 years,
Mm,
and we were able to show, using kind of a different technique than has been used before, two different data sets. One data set that had really good information on birth intention,
mm,
and another data set that had really good information on births. And we used one to estimate the likelihood, I guess, that a birth was unintended. And
mm,
we were able to show patterns over time. And one of the neat things is, we were able to sort of hold constant if the same types of people had given birth in different years, would we have expected the same degree of unintendedness, and kind of break down where things might have been coming from.
yeah.
And, perhaps not super duper duper surprising to people who really spend a lot of time thinking about birth intention. But we found a lot of the driver of changes in unintendedness that we observed in the last decade, or the decade after the Great Recession, was driven by younger women, and shifts to decreases in unintendedness among unmarried and young women.
Mm,
So what does this mean? It suggests that younger people are maybe better at meeting their fertility intention over this period. And the back part of the paper is really trying to uncover some plausible reasons why. And we suggested it has to do with a couple of different things. Maybe some changes in contraception access, maybe some changes in other behaviors. So I don't think we have a single reason, but there's a number of factors that are involved. As far as one other thing that we saw is that towards the very end of the period, there's a slight uptick in unintendedness. So, will it persist? Will it change? I think the world changed a lot. Our study ended in data with through 2019, I believe.
Right.
So anything that happened post, 2019, which includes a huge change to fertility and many other things, is not addressed in our study. So I think we can best think of this as something that happened post-Great Recession. One of the big things that happened too that we were able to uncover is that there's a lot of papers in economics that look at whether fertility moves in tandem with the economy, right? In good times, more babies, pro-cyclical, in bad times, fewer babies, counter-cyclical, how does fertility work? And a lot of the research says economy is good, people have more babies, and vice versa. What we showed is that the Great Recession, initially this is really true. All births were dropping. But one thing that we uncovered, which we thought was pretty interesting, is that in the time right after, the economy started to recover, we see, somewhat of a recovery in intended births that people intend to have. And here I'm kind of playing loose because it's our estimate of likely intended births. They recovered, as you would expect, in a pro-cyclical manner. But this was not the case with unintended births. They continued to fall well past when births started recovering. So we felt this was a real bifurcation in prior trends.
Is that a cohort drop?
So, I don't think it's entirely cohort drop because it's pretty widespread. But it does appear to be stronger for younger women. So could there be something for maybe millennial age and lower? Possibly. But these are also the cohorts that were exposed more early to long-acting reversible contraception and other things like that. So I think there's still more work to be done. And one of the interesting things that I would be interested to see is if these drops that we've been observing, if they're going to persist.
Yeah.
And, from what we looked at, it seems like maybe some of these drops are permanent and not just a timing thing where people are having no babies in their 20s and maybe they're making up for it in their later 30s. It doesn't seem like that's happening.
It's not like some change in the life, like where you're having a baby.
Yeah, it's not really like a
margin.
Yeah. So I think it's more likely this might be an extensive margin change.
And it's got something to do with these big macro shocks?
So, I think that could be part of it. It's not something that we tested directly. We were looking at the timing of the pattern, and it seemed to line up. You would expect things would get better as the recession we recovered from, but and by get better, I don't know. I think people who wanted to have kids started having kids again. People who weren't planning, I think is a way to think of it, to have children were better meeting that goal. Now, could the goal have changed? That's something more difficult to measure.
Are those kinds of questions in those surveys, like those kinds of thought questions like planning and
So
beliefs and
some have questions that try to query birth intention.
yeah.
For example, the General Social Survey has questions on that. Um, I not in the data set. We didn't make use of those in the data set we used, which was the National Survey of Family Growth.
You know, in the popular press, like seems like maybe a couple of years ago, I was every other paper
So
article.
I want to correct myself. I mean, we
Yeah.
didn't make broad use of those questions in our measure of intendedness. I think we did some analysis that I can't remember off the top of my head at the
Well,
moment.
it seemed like a couple of years ago, I was reading about this all the time that we were in a sex depression. It was like this kind of like, I mean, you know, I never knew how serious it was because I wasn't in the data, but there was just these popular articles like Atlantic Monthly kind of type articles where they were talking about how sexual behavior was down amongst the newer cohorts. And then I saw someone sort of say that the evidence for that was kind of weak. And I was just wondering, you know, I mean, if you've got drops in fertility amongst unintended births, did y'all look at whether or
So
not
some
there
of that
was changes in
it
sexual behavior?
could be due to changes in behavior. To be honest, we looked at a lot of things,
Yeah.
and I'm just trying to remember all of the different things that we ended up looking at.
I mean, is unintended births a big part of American fertility?
I mean, I think it is. It's been, I guess, I was just reading about this recently, like the history of unintended births in the US. I want to say they started kind of trying to measure it as far back as the 40s.
Mm,
And it's been, some part of data sets that have been used, fertility related data sets in the US uh, for quite some time. I think it started with what do they call it? The general fertility surveys,
mm,
some of the early ones, and then later the NSFG. The NSFG used to only ask fertility related questions of married women, and then they started asking of all women. And then in recent years, they've been asking these questions to men as well as women.
mhm.
So that's, you know, different things over time.
How do they ask it? How do you measure an unintended birth?
Right. So this is actually a question that you would think might be easy, but it's actually has a pretty long history of how this is made up.
Yeah.
Um,
Because it seems like
so
there's a lot of heterogeneity.
100%. So one of the more common data sets that's used to study unintended births currently in the US is something called the National Survey of Family Growth. And
Uh-huh.
this data set is the one that we really relied on to create our measure of likely unintended birth.
Uh-huh.
And in this data set, they ask questions, directly, was this birth unwanted? Were you unhappy with this birth? Were you,
Mm,
you know, not trying to get pregnant? Was the birth too soon? Um, and then combining, several of these things results in a measure of unintendedness.
what's like what are you why are you measuring this anyway? Not you, but like what's the economic relevance of trying to
So,
get at exactly like the non-intentional birth?
so I think in terms of like, I think like an economist, maybe there's other ways to think about this, but I think a common way to think about this in economics is that if you're planning out your your births, it's almost like you're planning what your investments in these child or children will be, and
Mm-hmm.
you're timing the births not only for what you're going to think about for these children later on after they're born, but you're also thinking about, if I have no children, what am I going to invest in as far as career,
Right.
education, that kind of thing.
Right.
When would I like to get married? Right? Is that going to
Mm-hmm.
be earlier or later, depending on if I want to have kids, if I want to have them, when I want to have them.
Right.
And then I think with the intention, part of the way it's queried in these surveys, some of them, including the NSFG, is they ask, was this kind of at the time that you were planning to have the child? And then if they respondent says something like, no, it was too soon,
Mm-hmm.
then it's, well, how too soon, right?
Right.
Was it a year too soon?
Yeah.
Was it like 4 years too soon?
Like an ever, or even like
Yeah,
an ever
yeah,
too soon. Right.
yeah. So, you can see where, if you have a baby at 19,
Yeah.
you might have planned to have a baby,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe you were planning to have that baby when you were 29,
Yeah.
and this is way too soon relative to what you were planning.
Mm-hmm.
And
How the
so,
heck do you tack? So how do you guys work with those questions to come up with like the
yeah.
taxonomy that's I
So
hate to say it this
there's
way,
a
but like
number. We
the
were not the first
harmful
ones to
versus the
tackle.
benign
So we
too
weren't the
soon.
first ones to tackle this.
Uh-huh.
So there was a paper by this, I think I want to say it was a sociologist, but I might be wrong, but it's from like, I don't know, 2002 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Hooley, I think is the author's name. And they basically kind of decided, I'm going to ask questions and I'm going to allocate these to describe intendedness or
Right.
unintendedness, as the case may be.
Right.
Others have kind of revised on that and followed that path. And
Yeah.
that's kind of more or less the path we decided to take in our paper.
Right.
Um, but I think it's useful to know that, the NSFG, it's just one survey.
Yeah.
It's only on US births, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of more my area of expertise
Mm-hmm.
and what we wrote about in that paper.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think it's useful to understand that intendedness is measured differently in different countries.
Yeah.
Uh, there's a there's a questionnaire that these researchers in London came up with. I think it's called something like the lump survey or something. I can't remember the exact name.
Yeah.
And they basically used, I don't know, I would describe it more of maybe a psychology or other type of model to
Yeah.
try to understand what kind of questions they should be asking.
Yeah.
And they put it into like a 6 item format.
Yeah.
And this questionnaire, it's like each item has sub questions and they're meant to gauge different parts of intendedness.
Yeah.
And it's like a scaled measure. And so if you're on, I think it's a 12-point scale, 2 points per each item. And then depending on how you answer those questions, right, it's kind of allocated as intended or
Mm.
unintended, right? But it's different because you have to administer this questionnaire. So you
Mm.
can't really always apply it to existing surveys from the 70s. It's more for contemporaneous
Mm.
work since they developed this. But that's been used in all over the world in different countries. So, I
Wow.
mean, there's more than one way to do this. So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
another set of researchers that have taken data that you can find kind of in the, I don't know, the World Bank type data, maybe. I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember exactly where they got their actual numbers from, but they're using some Bayesian technique to try to discern pregnancy intention with the data that's available across like 195 countries.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's definitely not only one way to measure it.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think maybe one of the biggest things I think with trying to think about intendedness and trying to measure it is thinking about when these questions are asked,
Uh-huh.
whether they be survey or whether, these existing kind of cross-sectional surveys that we rely on a lot in the US, or if they're surveys that are, questionnaires that are administered. A lot of this information is more of a retrospective nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to capture people before they become pregnant, asking these questions about intention, and then observing them after they've been pregnant. They do have a couple of these type of questions in the NLS, the longitudinal panels in the US. And some researchers have used those panels, but it only allows you to look at a narrow set of cohorts. So you're not really able to gauge kind of big trends over time, because you're kind of limited with a panel in looking at the cohorts that are in that panel.
Mm.
So I don't know, there's lots of
yeah, that's
things
really I'm surprised I haven't even crossed my mind before, because I was just thinking, two of our children were unintended. They were like, but they were more like in the intertemporal, to use like econ jargon, in the intertemporal decision wasn't too off.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just like at that exact moment, that wasn't really the plan. But I think my wife and I had a lot of flex on that it wasn't like ever sort of like there wasn't, we weren't stunned or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I could imagine that there's like a continuum where you get very stunned and upset and extremely distraught, and that's asymmetric for the partners, and they may not even be, they may not even be partners and things like that. But it's like, it seems like to measure it, you've got to start with some basic conceptual framework about why should I care about an unintentional birth.
Oh yeah. So I
Because
got
it's like you've got to go ahead and say some of these are costly, or some of these are not good, or there's like some kind of normative thing you've got to just start with.
I started out thinking, like if you're an individual utility maximizer, like thinking about your own utility in your family, investments in your children, that kind of thing. The other side of this is maybe thinking about it from a societal standpoint.
Yeah.
And so, uh, it's tricky, and I don't think maybe the math is as clean.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about um, people that might have children sooner than they wanted, and if by sooner than they wanted, if it's related to some educational investment or career decisions that they're making, maybe they're not quite at the, lifetime earnings trajectory they want to be at.
Right.
They're maybe don't end up getting the degree they thought they were going to get.
Yeah.
And how does that translate into the public finance scenario?
Right.
Maybe those kids are more costly.
It's the cost
From
work.
society's standpoint.
It seems like there's like the only way you can justify the questions is like somehow you've got to say these are on net negative.
Yeah,
It's weird to talk that way.
well, I don't know that that's entirely true. I mean, I think it's like just academically, I think it's an interesting question to understand if people have changes in their intended births over time,
Yeah.
right? I think that's, just if what you're planning is closer to what you're achieving, I think that that's an interesting kind of academic question on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think the tricky part is with the costs and benefits, the calculations are more difficult. I will say if you if you don't intend to get pregnant, let's take it to the extreme and say you don't even know you're pregnant. You don't take out any prenatal care. You don't modify any health behaviors during pregnancy.
Yeah.
This could lead to, a less desirable infant health outcome.
Right. Right.
Um, I'm not saying that happens with every unintended birth, but
Yeah.
I'm saying perhaps it's more common.
Yeah.
And then if that persists throughout that person's life course, I mean, that could be pretty expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always so funny the way that like the public policy questions, they're like so different than the way that I feel like I have to live myself. Like I we've had in our family a lot of things happen that were like, just really bad. I'm not even no, not even say they're bad. They just were like lotteries
Mm-hmm.
that were won, and they were definitely not. Uh, they weren't part of the plan, you
Yeah.
know, and so much of the work that, and they were very costly, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in terms of the cost to the family, the ending of relationships and all kinds of stuff. And
Yeah.
so, but it's like all the work that I've had to do is more like acceptance, and then, how can I move on, and converting these things. It's really had to change my whole philosophy of living. Less
Mm-hmm.
economic, really, less thinking in terms of cost and benefits, just more like, I don't know. But I'm not a woman, and I mean I am a father, but like it's just weird. I can't imagine a public policy conversation where I would have said we need to, well, actually I can imagine a public policy conversation where we talk about mental illness or something and talk about the impact it has on caregivers, but like the it's still sort of odd to me to just like not talk about how much of life is just very difficult.
Yeah.
So much of life is just so hard, and moving all these levers around so that nobody experiences it, it just seems kind of futile a little bit. Like,
That's
I
how I
mean, it's
look at
like,
it. I mean, I think just kind of circling back to birth intention and so forth. I mean, one way to look at this is that it costs more in public money to have children that are, let's not even, call like unwanted or anything like that, but missed times. Like, what if
right,
this baby happens, 3 or 4 years too early? Um, Maybe that's more likely to be a Medicaid funded birth,
right,
which is funded by public dollars instead of private dollars.
yeah,
Um, if you look at, I don't know, 15 years ago, half the births practically in the US were Medicaid funded,
half. What are they now?
close to 42%.
Huh?
So, and I haven't seen any like research on that to try to identify where that cut came from. It's kind of strange in some sense because the ACA
Right,
expanded Medicaid,
expanded it.
but a lot of pregnant women were already eligible.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure that that margin would have really expanded Medicaid much for that group.
yeah,
To have such a decline, goes right along with our finding that there's been this real shift in the fraction of births that are intended versus unintended.
right, 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 right.
So if you think
Yeah, and if you're watching a
people
decline
are,
in if you're watching a decline in the unintended, and you think that might be selecting on income, then even with an expansion of ACA, it might be that that compositional change might still mean it's like not necessarily bringing in more births. But what did people find? What are people finding on ACA expansion?
So with regard
To births and yeah, like just ACA, is it having any effect on births at all? I don't know. I don't know.
so I mean,
I'm
I think on the
intrigued by
margin,
this.
I don't remember all of the literature on the ACA off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But from what I do remember, it does, one of the big parts of the ACA was making contraception more accessible.
Uh-huh.
So to the extent that that happened, I would think that was decreasing the
Mm.
fertility. And I'm pretty sure I've read a paper, and I'm sorry if whoever wrote that is listening to conversation. Apologize.
I put you on the spot asking you to talk about a paper that I don't tell you the name of and didn't tell you to read. Um,
But I mean, it's definitely, I mean, I've read something along those lines. I can't recollect the exact details.
yeah.
But I know people have looked at that and linked the contraception, I
Right.
believe, the changes in fertility, but the magnitude I don't remember.
Yeah. 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 Well,
And
one more thing that I want to let you go. You've written a bunch on broadband
yeah.
and fertility, and I always thought that was really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about that work that you did on that? You've written
So that work is with Chris Herbst Arizona State.
Uh-huh.
And we had this idea that, having access to more information might influence fertility.
Yeah.
And that's basically more or less what we found. I don't recall the exact number, but I don't feel like it was a particularly large part of the explanation for the drop in fertility that we see over the period we looked at,
Yeah.
which was the big change in broadband access when we go from, what would be considered an analog world to a digital world.
Yeah.
When you go from a dial-up modem to having high-speed internet,
Yeah.
rolled out rather quickly for most people in the US from 1999 to about 2003.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at changes in fertility kind of midway through the decline that we've seen that I feel started around the early 90s.
Mm.
And we find, it explains a small-ish fraction of the decline over
What's
that
the
period.
mechanism? Is it learning online
So,
about contraception or something?
the data that we used, we couldn't really nail down mechanisms 100%.
Yeah.
But it seemed like what we what we looked at, it didn't seem like we didn't see, for example, I want to say we didn't find big changes in maybe rates of STD or something like that.
Mm.
So we're thinking, it had maybe something more to do with information, or
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think, what we
Right.
settled on.
Right. Huh.
Um,
Had you seen in the literature people suggesting this kind of thing, or was that something that you and Chris just kind of were talking and thought about it?
so there were papers that had looked at other things related to broadband,
Yeah.
related to the labor force, and one paper in particular looked at marriage markets.
Uh-huh.
And so we decided to look more at the teen fertility side of things.
Yeah.
And, to some extent, I think this, is maybe a distant cousin of these MTV and teen
Right.
fertility papers.
Right. Right.
Um, so, I mean, that was a different uh,
Huh.
research question, but
Do you,
um,
do you think you're going to keep working on this topic for a long time? Could you imagine it's just like it's not something that you get tired of? It's just in, I mean, even that conversation, I'm going to be preoccupied in my head the rest of the
about the
day.
measuring the
That the
uninhibited.
measurement thing, I just like even that just seems like
That's something I'm working on right now. Is
you
just
are.
about that. Yeah, just more like a book chapter on
It's really
uninhibited.
deep.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even like a major part of the chapter, but it's something, I mean, we definitely thought about in the paper with Casey and Lucy.
Yeah.
Um, but I've just been thinking about it more with this book chapter we've been working on with Christine and I. So
yeah. But you could see yourself working on this for a long time?
Unintendedness, fertility, trends in
Yeah.
fertility. Yeah, I mean, I even have I have another paper that is looking backwards in time and looking at the first demographic transition in the US and looking at access to markets and what does that mean for, you know, what did we see with those patterns, I guess is just a quick way to describe that. It's related in some sense to occupational shifting. So
Right.
yeah.
If it's time for another book on the economics of fertility, you could be the one to write it.
We'll see.
Let's see about that. All right. Well, Mel, it's so nice to have you on the podcast. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah.
It's always nice to see you.
Yeah. Likewise.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Take care.
Gotta see us through. Honey, you need me. Baby, I need